The world gasped as Princess Catherine, once the epitome of royal grace, issued a refusal that shook Buckingham Palace to its core. She would not attend another royal or state event until Queen Camilla publicly apologized. But what triggered such defiance? And why now? For years, Catherine had been viewed as the unshakable figure of stability within the monarchy, the silent strength who carried herself with elegance even under crushing pressure. Yet this moment revealed a side of her that few had ever seen: unyielding, unafraid, and unwilling to be silenced. The very idea that a future queen consort would draw a line against the reigning queen set off alarms across the entire establishment. Courtiers whispered in panic, aides scrambled for damage control, and officials attempted desperately to stop the leak that could not be stopped. Within hours, the refusal spread beyond the palace walls, carried by whispers that turned into headlines, leaving the monarchy exposed in a way it had not been since the darkest days of Diana. Behind those walls, the tension was unbearable. Senior courtiers, men and women who had spent decades upholding tradition, suddenly found themselves standing on shaky ground. How could they spin Catherine's outright defiance into anything less than a constitutional embarrassment? They drafted statements, rehearsed denials, but the truth was too explosive to contain. The silence of Catherine's absence would be more deafening than any press release. This wasn't a delay, a cancellation, or a polite excuse. This was an ultimatum, and the world knew it. In hushed corridors, servants carried the news to one another in disbelief. She's not coming. Not until the Queen bends. It was unthinkable, and yet, it had already begun. For William, the moment was shattering. He had always stood between two worlds, duty to the crown and devotion to his wife. But never before had those two loyalties collided with such violent force. As Catherine's words reverberated, William was dragged into the center of the storm. To support his wife meant challenging the monarchy that defined his entire existence. To protect the monarchy meant risking the trust and love of the woman he had sworn to stand beside. It was an impossible position, and already his silence was being judged. By choosing not to immediately defend Catherine's decision in public, William left space for suspicion. Was he wavering? Was he complicit in allowing Camilla's shadow to linger over his wife's dignity? Every pause in his response deepened the divide, and Catherine felt it keenly. Camilla, meanwhile, was blindsided. To her, the throne had been hard-won, and every inch of power fiercely protected. She could not imagine yielding in the face of what she saw as disrespect. Yet Catherine's refusal struck directly at her authority. If she gave even an inch, her crown would never be viewed as legitimate again. Her fury was unmistakable. Her words behind closed doors described as sharp, dismissive, and venomous. "She will learn her place," she reportedly snapped, but the words only revealed her fear. For if Catherine could bring the monarchy to its knees with silence alone, what else was she capable of if pushed further? It was more than just a clash of wills. It was a break with centuries of royal obedience. For generations, those who married into the family knew the rules: submit, endure, and maintain the facade. Catherine, once seen as the perfect example of this, had shattered that image in one decisive stroke. She was not waiting for whispers of reconciliation. She was demanding it, and not privately, but before the world. In that refusal lay the seeds of revolution, a rewriting of the royal script that none could ignore. And for the monarchy, the question hung heavier than any crown. What insult, what betrayal, what humiliation could have driven Catherine to risk everything? But to understand Catherine's thunderous stand, we must look at the chain of betrayals and humiliations that led her here. At first, it seemed like an ordinary family dinner at Windsor, but behind the polished silverware and polite smiles, Camilla delivered words that Catherine could never forgive. The evening had begun with the usual gestures of civility, carefully chosen dishes and rehearsed courtesies, but beneath the surface was an atmosphere so charged that even the youngest members of the household sensed something unspoken was at play. Catherine arrived prepared to perform her role with grace, her every movement measured, her every glance calculated to ease tensions that had been building for weeks. Yet, she could not have foreseen how quickly that facade of normality would shatter once Camilla decided to strike. The dinner unfolded with small talk, harmless anecdotes, and vague references to public engagements, but the undercurrent of rivalry hung heavy in the air. Then, with a tone coated in false sweetness, Camilla remarked on Catherine's so-called unearned influence. The words were sharp enough to pierce through the clinking of glasses and the murmured conversation, leaving the table in stunned silence. She did not raise her voice, nor did she disguise the venom behind her smile. The insult was deliberate, calculated, and aimed not just at Catherine's reputation, but at her very right to stand where she stood. To be told, in front of the royal family, that her place had been granted not through worth, but by circumstance, was a humiliation that no royal consort could easily bear. Catherine sat frozen, her posture rigid, but her eyes betrayed the sting. In that instant, she felt not just the weight of the crown that awaited her, but the shadow of every whispered doubt that had trailed her since she first entered the royal sphere. She had endured criticism from the press, endured the burden of public expectation, endured the comparisons to Diana. But this was different. This was Camilla, her own family by marriage, stripping away dignity in the one place Catherine should have been protected. What made it worse was the silence that followed, the silence that gave Camilla's remark legitimacy, as though no one dared to challenge it. William's reaction was immediate yet restrained. Fury flashed across his face, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. His silence was not approval, yet it was no defense either. To speak in that moment would have sparked a public scene within private walls, and William, bound by duty and instinct, chose restraint. Yet restraint cost him dearly. Catherine read his silence as abandonment, a choice to protect protocol instead of his wife. For William, the moment would linger as a scar on his inability to shield Catherine when she needed him most. That silence was a fracture, subtle but devastating, that widened the divide between duty and devotion. Anne, however, remained watchful. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, bore into the scene with quiet authority. She spoke no words, but her silence was not the silence of cowardice. It was the silence of someone who knew more than she could yet reveal. Her piercing gaze seemed to acknowledge the cruelty of Camilla's remark, but it also carried a warning, as if she had seen this pattern before. For Catherine, Anne's silence was both unsettling and intriguing. It suggested that the insult carried deeper roots, reaching into old rivalries and long-buried wounds. Indeed, Camilla's words did more than insult Catherine. They resurrected Diana's ghost. In that one cruel remark, the echoes of history roared back to life. Catherine, compared endlessly to the woman who had once been hounded and broken by the very institution she now represented, could not escape the parallels. To call her influence unearned was to repeat the whisper campaign that had once plagued Diana, that she was chosen for her image, her charm, her utility, but not her worth. The insult was more than personal, it was historical, and it placed Catherine directly in the cycle of pain that Diana had endured decades before. The dinner ended in silence, but Catherine left with her resolve hardening. The insult might have seemed fleeting to those who dismissed it as a petty jab, but for Catherine, it became the spark that ignited a palace-wide firestorm. Imagine being forced to choose between your mother's legacy, your wife's dignity, and the stepmother who wears the crown. This is the impossible bind William now faces. To the outside world, he is a man destined for kingship, a figure of calm, composure, and steady responsibility. Yet, behind palace walls, he is tormented by a decision that threatens to tear apart not only his marriage, but the monarchy itself. Catherine's refusal left him no room for neutrality. It demanded action, demanded allegiance, and every second of hesitation turned his silence into a statement of its own. Advisors circled him like vultures, whispering that the monarchy must come first, that Catherine's stand was reckless, that to yield to her would weaken the crown. But William was not only a prince, he was a husband, and the conflict between crown and heart pressed down on him like a crushing weight. Behind closed doors, Catherine's demands were clear. She did not want vague gestures or whispered reassurances. She wanted loyalty, unshakable and visible, a vow that no duty, no crown, no tradition would come before her dignity. For years, she had endured the compromises, played the role of the dutiful consort, swallowed the bitterness of slights and rumors. But now, she wanted more. She wanted a husband who would stand against Camilla's arrogance, a man who would not hide behind protocol when his wife was humiliated. Her words to him were sharp, edged with pain. What good is a crown if it costs us our truth? William, standing between her and the institution he was born into, felt himself pulled apart by forces too great for any one man to bear. Yet looming over this turmoil was the ghost of Diana. William could not escape it. Every whisper of discontent, every cruel remark, every moment Catherine was left vulnerable. Each one dragged him back to his mother's suffering. He remembered how Diana had been cast aside, her cries muffled by the machinery of monarchy, her pain magnified by silence. He had once sworn he would not repeat those mistakes, that he would protect Catherine from the fate that devoured his mother. And yet, as Catherine looked at him with eyes full of hurt, he realized the pattern was beginning again. His silence, his hesitation, was becoming its own betrayal, just as the silence of others had betrayed Diana decades earlier. The shadow of history closed in around him, suffocating and merciless. Meanwhile, Camilla stood unwavering, cloaked in the authority of her crown. To her, Catherine's refusal was nothing more than insubordination. She demanded protocol, demanded respect, demanded that William uphold the institution before all else. Her stance was unyielding. If Catherine wished to be queen one day, she would learn the rules of deference now. To give in to Catherine's demands would mean Camilla admitting fault, and in her mind, the throne left no room for apology. William, therefore, was pressured from both sides, a wife pleading for protection and a stepmother demanding submission to tradition. Each moment he delayed, each word he withheld, twisted the knife deeper. For Catherine, William's silence was unbearable. To her, it was not strategy or caution, it was betrayal. In her eyes, every second he failed to defend her dignity was a signal that he had chosen the monarchy over his marriage. The man who had once promised to shield her from the cruelty of the institution now seemed paralyzed by it. The hurt in her gaze grew heavier with each passing day, and William knew that his indecision was not neutral. It was eroding the very foundation of their bond. His heart was with Catherine, but his voice remained locked, and that silence became louder than any words could have been. But if William felt cornered, Catherine was already preparing a move no royal consort had dared before. For the first time in royal history, a future queen consort declared she would not bow to protocol until the reigning queen herself bowed first. Catherine's private vow was simple, uncompromising, and laced with fire. She would not attend another royal event, neither charity gala nor state banquet, until Camilla issued a public apology. It was not a whispered complaint behind palace walls. It was a firm declaration, delivered with icy clarity, and those who heard it knew immediately that the monarchy had entered uncharted territory. Catherine had chosen her battleground, and it was not subtle. She had chosen dignity over silence, confrontation over submission, and in doing so, she had unleashed a storm that could not be contained. How that vow made its way beyond the safety of closed doors remains one of the palace's most unsettling mysteries. Some insist it was deliberately leaked, either by Catherine's allies who wanted her stance made known, or by Camilla's supporters eager to paint her as divisive. Others whisper it was an unguarded servant, carrying words too heavy to keep secret. But whatever the source, the effect was devastating. By morning, the vow was headline news. Catherine's absence was no longer a private matter. It was a public declaration of war. The question was no longer whether she had made the vow, but whether she would follow through with it, and the world waited breathlessly to see. The media frenzy was unlike anything the palace had faced in years. Overnight, Catherine's defiance became the story on every channel and across every paper. Commentators described her as brave, unwilling to tolerate humiliation, the first royal consort in living memory who dared to challenge the throne itself. The public saw a woman who had endured enough, a mother protecting her children's future, and they rallied to her side. To many, her silence at events had always been dignified, but her silence now, her refusal to appear, became deafeningly powerful. She was not absent by accident. She was absent with purpose, and yet, not all voices celebrated her courage. Critics loyal to Camilla painted a different picture, calling Catherine arrogant, reckless, even dangerous. They warned that her defiance threatened the very fabric of the monarchy, that if one consort could demand an apology, the chain of obedience would unravel entirely. The split was sharp, and it fractured the nation into two camps: those who saw Catherine as the rightful torchbearer of dignity, and those who feared she was dragging the monarchy into chaos. For the palace, this division was catastrophic. Inside Buckingham, chaos reigned. Royal calendars were torn apart as Catherine's absence left gaping holes. Events that once revolved around her presence now stood empty. Hosts embarrassed, charities disheartened, and foreign dignitaries left questioning the stability of the crown. The machinery of the monarchy, polished by centuries of tradition, faltered as one woman's stand brought it to a halt. Courtiers scrambled, aides fumbled for answers, and the king himself was forced to navigate a family war, spilling directly into the public eye. Every scheduled event became a reminder that the future queen had drawn a line the monarchy had no idea how to cross. Camilla, of course, was incandescent with rage. To be cornered so publicly, to have her authority challenged not just behind palace doors, but on the world stage, was intolerable. Her fury was said to shake the very corridors of the palace, her words sharp enough to cut down those too timid to answer. Yet, her silence in public only worsened the crisis. Refusing to apologize made her look stubborn, even guilty, while Catherine's refusal only grew in symbolic strength. With every day Catherine stayed away, her power grew, while Camilla's crown looked less like a symbol of triumph and more like a reminder of division. And yet, beneath this defiance lay deeper grievances Catherine had kept buried for years. The dinner was only the tip of the iceberg. Catherine had endured years of quiet slights and whispered humiliations from Camilla's circle. Now the truth spilled out. Behind the regal smiles and choreographed public appearances lay a far darker reality, one that Catherine had carried in silence for far too long. She had been tested, diminished, and repeatedly undermined by those who feared her growing influence. And though she had mastered the art of patience, though she had swallowed indignities to preserve appearances, each wound left its mark. By the time Camilla's cutting remark struck at Windsor, Catherine's resolve had already been carved by years of private suffering. Among the earliest blows were the cruel whispers about Catherine's so-called common roots. Within Camilla's circle, it was said mockery often flowed behind closed doors, jokes aimed at Catherine's family background, insinuations that she lacked the aristocratic pedigree to sit at the heart of the monarchy. These barbs were designed not only to belittle Catherine, but to remind her that she would never be seen as equal in the eyes of those who believed bloodline was everything. Catherine endured it with grace, never allowing the world to glimpse her pain. But each remark was another stone laid in the wall of resentment that was slowly building. There were also battles fought in silence over patronages and causes that meant the world to her. Time and again, Catherine would learn that initiatives she had nurtured, charities she had championed, were quietly redirected to Camilla or her allies. It was a subtle form of erasure, a way of dimming Catherine's light without ever confronting her directly. The public saw her smile, but behind palace doors, she wrestled with the sting of knowing her influence was being clipped. Her reach narrowed, not because of her failures, but because of deliberate obstruction. Every time an opportunity slipped away, Catherine knew it was not fate, it was maneuvering. Even more personal were the disputes over Diana's treasured jewelry. For Catherine, Diana's pieces were not just adornments. They were symbols of continuity, reminders of a woman who had suffered and sacrificed, yet remained loved by millions. But again and again, Camilla blocked access to certain pieces, insisting they were inappropriate or unavailable. To the outside world, it seemed like a trivial matter of jewels. To Catherine, it was another wound. Another reminder that Diana's memory was being controlled, guarded, and rationed by the very woman who had once stood as her rival. This denial struck at Catherine's heart, deepening her sense of injustice and fueling her determination to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The cruelty went even further, spilling into the press. Articles that cast shadows on Catherine's character, stories that questioned her strength, her health, even her role as a mother. Too many of them traced back to Camilla's loyalists. Allies in the media, eager to please the Queen, spread whispers designed to weaken Catherine's public image. Though the world praised her poise, Catherine knew the cost of maintaining that facade. She carried the knowledge that betrayal lived not in rumor alone, but in the very halls of her family. And yet, she never allowed her mask to slip, choosing dignity even when her heart burned with outrage. This refusal to attend events was not born of a single insult. It was the culmination of years of wounds endured in silence. Catherine's smile had been her shield, but behind it lived a woman who had suffered one humiliation too many. The vow was not reckless defiance. It was a final act of survival, a declaration that she would not be reduced any longer. And when she finally broke her silence, it was not only Camilla who felt the weight of her defiance, it was the entire monarchy. But if Catherine's silence had finally broken, Camilla was about to face a humiliation of her own. Camilla was not about to bow quietly. She launched her counterattack, determined to remind Catherine who wore the crown. To her, Catherine's refusal was not an act of dignity, but a reckless tantrum, unbecoming of someone destined for queenship. Behind palace doors, Camilla's voice cut sharp, dismissing Catherine's stand as childish, a desperate ploy for attention that threatened to destabilize the monarchy itself. She believed Catherine had overstepped, dared to forget her place, and for that, Camilla resolved to strike back with every weapon at her disposal. What began as a cold war of silence now erupted into a ruthless confrontation, one that blurred the lines between personal animosity and institutional survival. The first strike came through the press. Allies loyal to Camilla, those who had long thrived on carefully placed whispers and venomous headlines, began painting Catherine as unstable. Articles appeared, questioning her composure, speculating about her health, even casting doubt on her ability to endure the pressures of royal life. To the casual observer, it seemed like the usual churn of tabloid noise, but to those who knew the machinery of palace influence, it was clear. This was no accident. These stories bore the fingerprints of Camilla's network, a deliberate attempt to weaken Catherine's image while she remained absent from public life. If Catherine would not appear, Camilla would make sure the absence was painted as weakness, not strength. Behind closed doors, the whispers grew darker still. At dinners, in hushed conversations, Camilla made private remarks questioning Catherine's fitness to be queen. She suggested her daughter-in-law lacked the steel required for the throne, that she could never handle the weight of the crown without crumbling. These words, though spoken in private circles, were repeated enough to find their way into corridors Catherine could not ignore, to hear her very future questioned, not by outsiders, but by the woman who currently wore the crown, deepened her wound and heightened her resolve. Camilla's aim was clear: diminish Catherine before she could rise. But while Camilla struck with the tools of power, something unexpected began to unfold beyond the palace gates. Public opinion did not bend in her favor. It turned against her. Crowds that once tolerated her presence now grew restless. The nation, weary of palace drama, found themselves sympathetic to Catherine, whose absence spoke volumes. Her silence carried weight. Her stand became a symbol of quiet resistance, and people began to see her not as disobedient, but as courageous. Every attempt by Camilla's camp to smear her image backfired, strengthening Catherine's place in the hearts of the people. This reversal only worsened matters for King Charles, who now found himself trapped between loyalty to his wife and the growing storm of public opinion favoring his daughter-in-law. He was forced into an impossible balancing act, trying to uphold the dignity of the monarchy while preventing his family from imploding. Advisors urged him to intervene, but any step risked alienating one side of the divide. His silence, like William's before him, only fueled speculation that the monarchy itself was teetering. The press framed it as a looming fracture at the very top, a crisis that could spiral beyond control. Inside the palace, the whispers grew bolder. Could this feud escalate into something far greater? Something resembling a constitutional crisis? If Catherine truly refused to return until Camilla yielded, and Camilla refused to apologize, what would become of the monarchy's unity? Could the institution survive a public standoff between its present queen and its future one? These were not questions of petty family drama. They were questions of survival for the crown itself. But what Camilla underestimated was Catherine's hidden weapon, her bond with the people and with Diana's legacy. When Catherine refused to attend royal events, many saw not a modern rebellion, but the echo of Diana, once silenced, now speaking again through her daughter-in-law. What might have appeared as a simple protest began to take on symbolic weight, drawing eerie parallels with the struggles of the late Princess of Wales. The media wasted no time weaving the narrative. Catherine was no longer just a wife and mother standing against humiliation. She had become the living embodiment of Diana's unfinished story. Every headline, every broadcast, every whispered conversation seemed to resurrect the specter of a woman who had once stood against the very same forces Catherine now challenged. Newspapers across the globe placed Catherine's name beside Diana's, their images aligned as if history itself demanded the comparison. Old photographs resurfaced, Diana refusing to be in Camilla's presence, Diana casting down her eyes during moments of public slight. Diana's isolation played out in front of the world. These images, once locked in the past, suddenly returned to the front pages, sparking outrage and remembrance. To the public, Catherine's absence was not hers alone. It was a haunting reminder of Diana's pain, a story that had never truly ended, now retold through another woman, bound to the same crown. The narrative caught fire quickly. Catherine, who had always carried herself with quiet strength, was now seen as the rightful heir to Diana's spirit, not by blood, but by dignity. Her refusal to bend to Camilla's authority felt like a continuation of Diana's defiance, the voice of a woman long gone rising again through her. Crowds that once simply admired Catherine now embraced her as a protector of Diana's legacy, a guardian of a truth that had been buried but never forgotten. And as the world drew these comparisons, Catherine's silence gained an almost holy reverence. She did not need to speak, for Diana's shadow was speaking for her. Even the jewels carried new meaning. Each piece of Diana's jewelry that Catherine had worn in the past now returned to public memory with haunting significance. Images of her in Diana's sapphire ring, her diamond tiaras, her bracelets, all became symbols of continuity, of a torch being passed from mother-in-law to daughter-in-law, from one generation of struggle to the next. These jewels were not seen as adornments, but as relics, each one glowing with the weight of memory, each one reminding the world of a woman whose life had been marked by betrayal and whose daughter-in-law now stood on the same battlefield. For William, the parallels were unbearable. His mother's face stared back at him from every front page. Her words echoed in every commentary. He had promised himself Catherine would never endure what Diana endured. And yet, here he was, watching history repeat itself. The silence at home, the whispered tension at dinners, the unspoken accusations all dragged him back into the anguish of his childhood. He was not only torn between his wife and his stepmother, he was torn between past and present, between memory and reality. Camilla, however, could not escape the harshest spotlight of all. The media painted her as history's repetition, the same figure who had once stood at the center of Diana's heartbreak, now standing at the heart of Catherine's. Commentators suggested that Camilla had not learned from the past, but was destined to repeat it, once again pushing a beloved princess to the breaking point. What began as a feud between two women was now cast as a generational cycle of cruelty, with Camilla as the constant shadow. With Diana's ghost looming larger than ever, the standoff now threatened to bring the entire monarchy into disrepute. Soon, it was no longer a private feud. The entire nation was forced to choose Queen Camilla or Princess Catherine. What began as whispers behind palace gates had spilled into the streets, onto screens, and across the voices of millions who suddenly found themselves participants in a royal war. Social media lit up like wildfire, hashtags praising Catherine surging to the top of global trends. Each post, each message, carried a note of rebellion, casting her not as a runaway consort, but as a woman of principle, refusing to bend beneath the weight of arrogance. The more she remained silent, the louder the world spoke for her, turning her absence into an anthem. Editorials followed, their tones sharp and merciless. Leading voices in the press condemned Camilla's refusal to speak, branding her silence as stubborn pride in the face of dignity. Articles painted her as tone-deaf to the suffering she had caused, unwilling to acknowledge the pain her words inflicted. In contrast, Catherine was held up as a figure of quiet strength, the one who had borne insult but refused to be erased. Each day, Camilla avoided apology. The criticism grew, and her crown appeared less a symbol of victory and more a shackle binding her to the mistakes of the past. Crowds at public appearances made the division undeniable. Once polite applause greeted Camilla's arrival, but now the air cracked with boos, jeers, and signs demanding respect for Catherine. The optics were devastating. The reigning queen humiliated in front of her subjects, the echoes of disapproval ringing louder than any ceremonial fanfare. Where Catherine's absence had first seemed a void, it now became a rallying cry. Her empty seat at royal events stood as a silent protest that all could see, a constant reminder that the monarchy was fractured, and that fracture was bleeding into the public eye. The burden of this conflict pressed hardest on William. Sympathy for him swelled across the nation as the public watched a man torn between wife and crown, love and duty, past and future. Commentators mourned the pain in his silence, the weight of his position, and the impossible choice that threatened to define his reign before it had even begun. Catherine's cause won hearts, but William's suffering pulled at the nation's soul. Many feared what the cost would be, not only for his marriage, but for the monarchy itself. Even the political class, normally hesitant to wade into royal disputes, began to act. Quietly, discreetly, voices in government pressed King Charles to resolve the crisis. It was no longer simply a family matter. It had become a matter of national stability. The monarchy, long considered above the petty conflicts of men, was now seen as fragile, even vulnerable. Politicians feared that if the rift deepened, the cracks could extend beyond family ties and into the very foundation of the crown's authority. The line had been drawn, and it was no longer confined to Catherine and Camilla. It stretched across the nation, forcing every subject to declare allegiance. The battle of wills was now a battle of identities, one queen's silence against another's defiance, each side demanding loyalty. And in this clash, there could be no middle ground. And as the battle spilled into the public square, palace insiders whispered of a final decisive confrontation. One final demand echoed through the halls of Buckingham. Catherine would return only if Camilla apologized not in private, but before the entire world. The boldness of her stance shocked even her closest allies, for this was not negotiation, but an ultimatum. Catherine had drawn a line in stone, her silence transformed into a weapon that cut sharper than any words. Camilla's fury was immediate, her pride refusing to bow, for she knew that a single apology would unravel the fragile authority she had fought so hard to claim. Yet the longer she resisted, the weaker her crown appeared, and whispers of collapse grew louder. King Charles stood paralyzed, torn between the woman he loved and the son and daughter-in-law upon whom the future of the monarchy depended. Behind the scenes, royal staff scrambled in panic, drafting contingency plans for a future no one wanted to imagine. The very institution itself trembled, the monarchy at risk of fracture unlike anything seen in living memory. And still, the world waited, breathless, for the answer to one question that now held everything in its grip. Will Camilla bow, or will Catherine walk away forever? And as the world watches, one truth is clear. This is no longer just a feud, it's a battle for the very soul of the monarchy. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.